Welcome to another edition of Underground Strategy. And our guest today is someone really special, someone who embodies courage, but also creativity. And I'll add to that a little bit of transformation. You'll hear about that during the rest of the session. But he's someone who stood on the front lines of war, in the Ukrainian war, after the full-scale invasion by Russia. And now he is taking that a step further, converting his service into something new through the strength of healing, through performance. We have Serhii Velychanskyi, who has served in the Ukrainians' 130th Territorial Defense Battalion and took part in the defense and liberation of Irpin and the Kharkiv region. In 2023, he went on to become an officer and joined the 72nd Center for Moral and Psychological Support. So quite a guy. And then he was working directly to support the well-being of Ukrainians' armed forces. A big welcome, Serhii, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much. If we can start at the beginning of your military journey, you joined the 130th Territorial Defense Battalion on the 24th of February. That was the first day of the Russian full-scale invasion. Can you take us back to that moment and what motivated you to enlist and what were those early days like?
Well, first of all, from the beginning of the 2022, I had already joined the exercising with the 130th Battalion. They did weekend trainings for the recruits. So I was preparing to become a reserve soldier and I was ready to sign reserve contract. And I was planning to sign it on the 24th of February. So I had prepared all the documents, everything, all the paperwork. So when I was asked at that time with my friends my friends asked me, why are you doing this? Russia will not, wage a full-scale war in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. And I said, well, here's the thing. If Russia doesn't invade us, then I just found myself a good hobby for the weekends. A good masculine hobby to put on the uniform and just run around the forest and do exercises, kind of play big boys games. But if they do, I will know who I'm fighting with, who my commanders will be. So I will be at least emotionally prepared, knowing that my sergeants and my officers have got the training and I already know them personally. And that actually would really help a lot because a lot of territorial defense forces companies in the battalions were created right on the spot. So they situatively were put together and they had no time to even get to know each other. They were put into war, into combats. So at that time, the question that I asked was not if they invade. The question was for me and for my brothers when they invade. So that's what my thinking was. As you remember, that was the time when there were several times when they had some certain dates that the invasion was expected. Like February 16th was a big date that we were kind of waiting. Well, on the February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, we did an English improv comedy that we invited all the foreigners that still remained in Kyiv. And we called the show with, double meaning, Nowhere to Run. So it was like, love affair and or this situation with the war. Nowhere to run. We're like, here, this is our home. On the 16th, nothing happened. But then on the 22nd of February, I did another one of my workshops in the evening. I had some guys, some press crew from Denmark. They were interested about the same thing, territorial defense. So they did a pretty good story. So on the 22nd and on the 23rd, I was doing some final shopping here and there, little things. And on the 24th, I was planning to go shopping for a bulletproof vest, which I did not and already then got it from the army.
It's an amazing story, the way you put it like that, Serhii. So in the West, I think in broad, from the outside of Ukraine, maybe even everywhere, some people said, yeah, Russia will invade. And many thought, nah, Russia won't invade. It's interesting that you said even some of your friends were having that same kind of discussion inside, right?
Yeah, truly, the society, most of the civilian people, they did not believe that it's going to happen of such a scale. Another thing you need to remember that the war is going on for 11th year. So back in 2014, they annexed Crimea and waged some combats and different military operations in the east of Ukraine. Many people still didn't believe that it's really happening, though it was happening in our country. But many people still chose to live in their own bubble. And only those that participated, only the volunteers that supported, that, found uniform, found bulletproof vests, provided food. Because you need to remember that at that time, 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, when we ousted the corrupted president and the Verkhovna Rada, or the parliament, had made all the legal preparations for the new elections. This is to answer the question that sometimes the Kremlin is promoting the rhetoric that, we illegally dismissed legal president. No, it was not. He left his position by himself. And so he left the country. He escaped to Russia, and he left the country on its own in the face of the enemy. And so all the legal procedures were kept. All the new president Poroshenko was elected at that time. So the army was completely demoralized. The previous president, Yanukovych, that we had removed, he had led to the point that our army was just a statistical group of people wearing a uniform. So we pretty much started rebuilding army from the beginning. And so the first battalions of the volunteers came out of just civilians with no bulletproof vests, with no uniform, just AK-47 or AK-74, the machine guns. And some units even went to the front line with no guns. They took the guns from the enemy. And that was the very hybrid war when Russia kept denying its participation in this war. But we knew that from moment to moment, there was a lot of participation from the regular army of the Russian Federation. And then, of course, all the supplies with the tanks, with the cannons, with all the artillery systems and all that. There is no way that the rebels, quote unquote, could find them, So that was the war that was going on. It was local, yes. It didn't involve the far away territories. So the territories like 200 kilometers and more, they would not even notice. But then in the 24th of February, 2022, that was a completely change, because with the long range missiles attacking at the same time, simultaneously, many cities, I woke up at, can't remember, 6 or 7 in the morning because of a huge explosion. And the interesting fact was that about at 6, I got a phone call from journalists from Australia. They kind of wanted to talk to me, and I'm like, no, come on, I'm sleeping. Let's talk a little later. Well, how about this war that started? I was like, what war started? Come on, I'm sleeping. So let's talk in a few hours. And then I woke up because of a huge explosion at the Hostomel airport, where the airborne first were deployed on our territory. And that's how it started. I woke up, I was shaking. I was, the combat stress started taking a big hold of me. But I was ready. I was waiting for the text message where we meet, and that's it.
Oh man, I can't imagine what you must have gone through, Serhii. You've just given this long discussion about what's happened since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the fighting in the east.
Because I believe that this is the context that needs to be kept.
Very much. And I'm so glad that you gave that for our listeners. And I like also the way you've explained how the army started from scratch, really, in 2014. And then, from different people, I've heard that let's say even from the start, they were more experienced, less experienced, but the investment in training really paid off, by 2022 with a full-scale invasion. And I think, just watching from the outside, one really sees the results, like for the invasion from Belarus southwards, and you see the armored vehicles getting bogged down in really this kind of infantry operations and really hard tough fighting. One sees this kind of conventional war. I mean, everyone that's on the right side of history will say, yeah, that was a tough and a good fight. And I'm just thinking, so much happens there. You've mentioned combat stress. You're going into this role, and your unit had a very important role, especially in the defense and liberation of Irpin and Kharkiv. Can you walk us through those operations, how it was on the ground a little bit, and what challenges you and your comrades faced, and then also maybe how that experience helped shape you and what you've learned from that?
Well, on February 24, once we got together, our first company of the 130th Battalion, you need to understand that there was thousands of people lining up to join the territorial defense. Because of that, there were many different companies created, up to 10, I guess, of the battalion, which shouldn't have been that many, because the right amount is like 4 or 5 companies within one battalion. So we had up to 10, and all of them were like brand new from scratch. Just a few people with some experience from their deployments in 14th, 15th, 16th. But most of the people were like 100% civilians. But our first company was the most prepared, most organized, because we were the ones that had gone through trainings before. I was happy that I had joined them. So on the first day, we immediately went to the Kyiv-Zhuliany airport, which is located right almost in the middle, in the center, near the center of Kyiv, to get ready for the attacks and the attempts to subdue the airport and start deploying in their airborne forces. So we went there, and we were there preparing, doing the fortifications and preparing it for the defense. And thankfully, for our luck, no attack happened. There were a few attempts, but they were stopped on approach by the air defense. So the helicopters a few were brought down, so they did not pursue with the attempt to go into the city. So it was lucky for us because, as much as we thought we were prepared, now we know we were completely little kiddies, we were not prepared comparing to what we had encountered afterwards. So being there for 2 weeks, Irpin had already started the defense, the local territorial defense, the local guys, half of them, a couple of 100 guys, really joined together, and half of them were with some previous experience, and half of them completely new to the war art. So they had withstand some big first attacks with the huge columns of the vehicles, tanks, and all that stuff. They had pretty much set up the blocks on the narrow roads on the entrance of the city. So there is Bucha and Irpin. Those were like very close cities, towns that gradually switch from one to another. There is like little roads that unite them. And so they were able to block those roads. So when Bucha was already taken, they could not enter into the town of Irpin. Only 30% of Irpin was occupied by Russian forces. So when we got an order to leave the airport, legally we were Kyiv Territorial Defense. Territorial Defense was not a regular armed forces, so we could not go to the battlefield immediately or elsewhere outside of our territorial responsibility. So we were asked, will the volunteers go to Irpin to help the local territorial defense? Well, 95% of our company said, yes, we're going. Because you need to understand that Irpin is so close to Kyiv that every other of our members of our company had either family or an apartment or some real estate or friends or whatever. So it was like a very common place for us, a very near to our heart. And we knew that's the last standing fortress before they really enter Kyiv. So we went there, and it was an abandoned city. There are a lot of stories about how difficult it was for the people to evacuate. The Russians kept shelling the city, killing a lot of civilians that are trying to escape, shooting down the civilian vehicles and cars. It's a huge, terrible story. So we were given certain area to prepare, to defend, to dig the trenches and prepare the fortifications. set up the outposts. And so at first, the most difficult thing for us was, it was not like a machine gun combat. It was like a heavy shelling on a daily basis. Like most of our wounded, I think over 20 of, 90 people, over 20 plus or so people were wounded by shrapnel from the incoming shells. And so it was a heavy shelling. That was the time when we first saw what the phosphorus bombs were. They used them even like during the day, looks like fireworks, very beautiful. But, 800-degree temperature burns through anything. Like I would say that was my first time when I thank God for wind, because it exploded right over our trenches, but then it fell about 5 meters away from us. I even have a video of the next day, the leftovers of the phosphorus. And then there was an attempt to break through by the Russians, and that's where we had encountered our first loss. Mars, that's the call sign of Serhii, another Serhii. He was the unit commander, and he and a bunch of other guys, they countermeasured the attempt to break through, and they were successful. The Russians were kicked out, but unfortunately, from our company, he was the first to be killed in action. Physically, it was like difficult because it was an abandoned city. As a creative person, the person from, an actor and all that, I thought that's the ideal for like movies about catastrophes or the end of the world movies. If you look the Will Smith I Legend, that's like what you see. No people. It was like unsurreal. And like at night, it was like as dark as you could just even imagine. Yeah, so it was very emotionally difficult, but we did it. Because we were just a territorial defense, we were not given like a very important assignments as far as like storming the positions or all that. Usually the territorial defense worked alongside with the regular special forces. They would move in and we would move behind them to hold the ground. They would move further, we would follow them and take the ground. That's the way it worked, pretty much.
No, I do understand what you mean there, Serhii, and you're being very modest in saying that, of course, some specialized units will move in front, but, I'm sure our listeners will agree to say that you did a hell of a job, and you're just mentioning digging trenches, defensive works, being shelled, fighting back. It can't be easy, and all I'll say is thank you so much for sharing that with us and with our listeners today, and also for your colleague and commander, also by the name of Serhii, call sign Mars. We want to send a message of thanks for his service, and I'm sure that everyone sees him as a hero for the work that he's done. And all that we can do is keep that kind of memories alive, which is a lot of what we try to do on this show, is tell the untold stories. And thank you so much for sharing that part. And if I may go a bit further on that, how was the experience in Kharkiv? You mentioned Irpin.
Yeah, well, after Irpin, we already felt very confident in what we're capable of doing. So we were given 5 days for R&R. And then April 11th, we were deployed to Kharkiv area. That was a long deployment till November. And the Kharkiv area was liberated on September 11th. So we were participating in all the defense actions, defense strategies of the general headquarters of the armed forces. At that time, our main purpose was to hold the ground, observe the potential movements of the Russian forces, and to react. Again, it was a difficult time of a lot of shelling, targeted shelling pretty much, because they knew where we were. So they were very generous in not sparing any shells on us. And there is a village called Dementivka that was a very difficult week for our battalion, where we lost a lot of people. I'd say about 40. That was very, very intense combat, and it was difficult, very difficult. a lot of our companies from our battalion lost a lot. We were a little more lucky because we were first to go in, but then again, we lost another brother of ours with call sign Smile. You need to understand what the territorial defense was. Smile was one of the bank's board members. So our company in the 2022, you would have like 3 hard degrees on 2 people, like a lot of people from different businesses. Another buddy of mine, dear to me, unfortunately, he died. He was killed in action in 2024. Call sign Papai. He had left his yacht in Odessa to join the battalion and to go through the infantry work. Though he was a seaman, he is into travels, into conquering the waves. So there's a number of brothers that we will always remember. And Kharkiv area was difficult in addition to what I already said, that it took the life of our commander of the battalion, call sign Medic. He had previous experience in the war from 2015, I guess. But then he was a captain. He was the commander. He took us through Irpin and Kharkiv. But unfortunately, his life ended in action during the times of the liberation of Kharkiv.
Again, I just want to thank you for sharing that, Serhii. I know that's not easy. And to all soldiers, officers, etc. that passed away and that sacrificed, you mentioned call sign Smile, call sign Popeye, call sign Medic, amongst the others. You mentioned 40 that deceased. We honor those fighters.
Thank you.
And a part of it is that we keep that memory alive.
Exactly.
I'm not a specialist, but when I was in the army, a lot that we were told by the psychologists were how we understand the trauma is the story we tell afterwards. Of course, when you are 20 years old, it's hard to understand this, but then with time and, definitely with having this very striking conversation today with yourself, Serhii, I think it becomes more true than ever. We built a memorial for them, not only in stone or statue, but also through the discussion. And you've spoken really well on all of that. You mentioned also about your experiences in improv, in acting.
Exactly.
And all the professionals that were with you. It reminds me of, the histories of like the Second World War, when this person was a teacher and that person was an engineer and this person was an architect. But then when the war came, they all fought. And it's crazy that, in the 2025, we are still having this discussion about full conventional war. But on the psychology part, in 2023, you became an officer and joined the 72nd Center for Morale and Psychological Support, and fair play to you. And that's a shift from the front lines. And you move towards supporting others psychologically. And from what you've said to me just in our pre-chat before we started, something that's very important to you. And what does that work involve? And how do the soldiers that you work with respond to that?
Well, because of my degree and my experience, I was offered to join the newly formed center. All the branches of the armed forces of Ukraine were setting up the centers like this. We had the 74th Center of the Territorial Defense. Basically, this is one of the standards of NATO. And then the brigades were starting the combat stress control groups. So that's again the NATO standards. And we were in the middle of all of that. Thankfully, we got very good professionals in our team, all that had gone through 2022 as infantrymen, but they had the education and the experience. So now it was time to recognize, hey, these guys can really do the work. It was very challenging because we had to deal and work and visit and collaborate and communicate with the troops in the combat. Like we were in the general combat zone, and that was the time for the battle for Bakhmut, the famous and very historical city where the Cossacks had their units. That was a very difficult time because, you see, the modern warfare is like this. You leave about 5, 7, 10 kilometers from the front line, from the actual front line, maybe 15. And so you go with the unit for a week or two, and then you're substituted with another unit. So pretty much there is no way to recreate, to rest. That compiles to a huge combat stress because there is no way for you to get out to a more peaceful territory. Now, with the use of long-range missiles and other long-range weapons, they would really target and shoot with the air reconnaissance that they use. Of course, we use them as well, but they use quite effectively. And so they would try to find the locations of different units and they would try to target them. That's another thing which makes it unique from all other operations of any other army in the world, because you're not located in camps, like army stations. No, you're dispersed to like little houses have destroyed with as little as 3 to 5 to 7 people in the houses. So to maintain the coordination and maintain the control of the units, that's a huge challenge for the commanders. And so we would visit little houses with as small as 2-3 people or as big as like 10-15. And we would take time to talk with them and to help them talk out their issues. And then I was an expert, and I'm still an expert in after-action review. That's the NATO standard of evaluating the experience and preventing the losses and increasing the quality of the performance of the unit. So the standard is quite a powerful tool. And so I would teach the commanders, I would teach the sergeants how to do this. And the interesting thing is, makes it unique, that the NATO standard after action review is used after training or after combat operation when they are pretty much in a green zone and they can, evaluate the success, the mistakes, and make conclusions for the future operations. So AAR is playing a huge part in the decompression format. Being in the war zone, in the combat zone, they can still decompress little by little. So if the AAR is done on a regular basis, they use this tool. This makes it unique again, because not everywhere like us, like the psychologists could visit, could come, and not often, because if we are 172nd Center for the territorial defense, and we're talking about like 31 brigades at that time of the territorial defense, so we could not, and if each brigade has 4 or 5 battalions, so we could not visit them often, and each battalion has 4 or 5 companies, so we're talking about like a lot of people, so we could not visit them often. So we would try to teach them the principles of self-help. Of course, we would teach them about combat stress, about the reactions of our organism to the combat stress, all those things where they would feel a bit more confident. Because remember, those guys, yesterday the civilians, now in the armed forces, so they had not had almost any formal training or any lectures or anything. So they really needed this like yesterday, It was like even too late, but we were still giving them because that was the need.
Quick pulse check. Are we on target? Drop a review on your app and hit subscribe on YouTube. Every click helps to keep the momentum going. Let's move ahead.
It very much is, and I'm sure was and still is needed, Serhii. And that's very interesting the way you've talked about the after-action report becoming a means of therapy, just allowing people to talk through certain things. And I'm pretty sure, just from the little bit that I know, that your improv background, your style, would help you to negotiate. You're saying going to these ruins and you find 7-8 soldiers there. I'm sure this would help you to interact with some of the soldiers. Just having this, you can just adjust to the situation, maybe more than no offense to anyone out there, but someone that's more stiff and, comes there with a tie and, or whatever. I'm not that I'm saying they are that in the war zone, but you know what I mean. You can gain the confidence maybe of those soldiers and allow them to express themselves to you.
Yes, improv played a very vital role there. First of all, improv is the reaction to the unexpected circumstances. That's the idea of improv. That's what you do hundreds of times on stage, performing or in the trainings and stuff. Now, when you come to the guys that just came out of hell, had lost a few of their own brothers, and you come with a certain agenda, and you can understand that you have to adopt now. Otherwise, they're not going to listen to you. Otherwise, you're just another officer that they think has never been in the trenches. So, yes, building the rapport with the guys, when it's appropriate, throwing in some humor or some situation or even interaction, the knowledge how to facilitate the discussion, making sure that everyone is involved, everyone is able to speak, not taking personally their aggression sometimes, their, emotions, being able to lock it up and keep it away from me and still letting them decompress with their build-up emotions. That was a huge challenge, but that's where improv, it was really a big thing. And in fact, I used it as well when we were doing trainings for the combat and operations stress groups. When we were training those officers when they were, I used improv as well to help them be more flexible, because being flexible in the wartime, that's like a need and trait number one. If you're stiff, if you are too much into agenda, you're not going to be accepted by the soldiers, by the guys who have seen hell and are about to see hell in a few days. So that was a challenge, but that's where improv really helped me a lot.
Totally. That absolutely makes sense. Not that I've been in that hell of a situation you mentioned, but just from what you said, it does resonate.
And that marks the end of part 1 of Tony's talk with Serhii. And we will be back with part 2 next week. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.